Now, racial tensions in South Africa have once again come under the spotlight as EFF protesters marched to Brackenfell High School against what they call racism at the school after a matric dance organized by parents was attended only by the white learners at that school. To talk about the rising racial tensions in the country is the Institute of Race Relations, Gabriel Krauser. A very good evening to you, Mr. Krauser. You know, we talk about the rising state of race relations in South Africa, but are they really rising? Based on the research that you've done, has this always perhaps been the status quo, volatile racial relations?
Yeah, I mean, so South Africa has a terrible history. The evil and wicked legacy of apartheid is in the front of minds of people who lived through that, and I think for youth like me who didn't, we understand that pretty well too. If you look at social media, if you look at headlines, if you look at the things that grab attention, race relations have been getting worse in the last few years. If you speak to the man on the street, so to speak, the woman on the street, who doesn't get much attention, if you do statistical surveys like we do that are demographically representative across class, color, creed, and so on, then you find that race relations have actually been improving. That's to say, more South Africans believe that we need to work together across racial lines than ever before. A supermajority of South Africans, 80%, believe that job appointments need to be based on merit. 90% don't care what color of skin their children's teachers are, as long as they do a good job. 60% think that politicians talk about racialism and colonialism as a way to excuse their own failures. So I think ordinary South Africans are aware of the fact that you really need to judge a person by the contents of their character and not the color of their skin. But that's not to say that we don't have incidents that are extremely concerning and that draw well-warranted attention.
And that's what I'd like to talk to you about. I mean, there's a difference between race relations and actual existence of racism and discrimination based on the color of one's skin. How are those incidents, according to your numbers? How rife are they?
So it's hard to say. I mean, one of the questions that we ask is, have you ever personally experienced racism? And in our latest survey, about 60% of black South Africans said that they've never personally experienced racism. So that is hugely encouraging if you compare it to the numbers that we had in 2015, and hugely discouraging if you consider the fact that 40% of black South Africans say they have personally experienced racism. And you see similar numbers, although much rising, in racial minorities. Colored South Africans, Indian South Africans, and white South Africans have much higher numbers of saying they've personally experienced racism. So in that regard, it does seem like a mixed bag. Certainly strong improvement amongst black South Africans, but still a long way to go, and amongst all South Africans, a distressingly high level. But again, if you compare it to 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, much improved.
But I must say, Gabriel, I want to ask you here the converse of the statement that you've just made now. Because sometimes one may not even know that they have been a victim of racial discrimination. If that question that you asked to black South Africans was asked to white South Africans on whether or not they have discriminated or denied positions or denied opportunities to people of, black origin, black people, what has that answer been? Is that an exercise that you've conducted?
No, we haven't asked people whether they have enacted racial discrimination. I mean, there are lots of black racists, there are lots of white racists, there are lots of colored racists, and there are lots of Indian racists, for sure. But that's the kind of behavior that people are unlikely to admit to in a survey, and so it's just not something we can statistically get a grasp on. So what you need to do in order to try and get a sense of the extent to which that dominates society is look at the kinds of stories that have come out of alleged, in the case that you asked for, white on black racism. And in those cases, again, you see a bit of a mixed bag. I mean, most famously, you've just been talking about Jacob Zuma. His front row of his keepers were those who said white monopoly capital is responsible for all ills in the country. They alleged a rogue unit that was racist in SARS. They alleged racism in the SAPS, the Cato Manor conspiracy theory. They found, ever since Bulelani Ngcuka was called Impimpi, or an agent of the apartheid police force back in 2003 when he was the National Prosecuting Authority and alleged that Zuma was guilty of corruption, you've had allegations of racism, white on black racism, that have been disproved. In addition, when it comes to schooling, Brackenfell is the story of the week. It's just the case that there is WhatsApp evidence that black and colored students were invited to that party and declined those invitations, some because they were too busy and some because they couldn't afford the exorbitant cost, which was partially based on the fact that COVID regulations meant fewer people could go, so it's harder to split the costs. Also, most white kids didn't go to that party, so it's hard to say that it was a racially exclusionary thing. I have personal experience in reporting on the grand racism story of 2019 when it comes to schooling. At the start of the year, Elsabe Olafir, a teacher at Swazi Reneker Law School, was accused of being racist because there were images of her classroom where black kids were sitting at one table, white kids were sitting at another table. I went to go figure out what was really going on there, spoke to black parents who had had their kids in her class the previous year, who said she was an amazing teacher, gave extra lessons, gave her heart and soul to their children. In fact, when protesters came to attack the school that year, Elsabe Olafir was one of the last teachers to leave, and part of the reason was two of her black students' parents hadn't arrived back yet because they were far away, and so even while the fences were being pulled down, she wanted to stay and protect her black students. So, I mean, if you look at the further circumstances, the parent who made the original allegation withdrew it and said he's very sorry, he understands what was going on.
I think
was a case where the parent apologized for making an allegation of racism, but no one else did. Everyone else, all the other major politicians who made allegations of racism, and then the evidence came to show that that's not what happened, didn't apologize. So that's to say it's very hard to know what's really going on in this country because evidence doesn't seem to be the thing that decides the day.
And I guess ultimately, to every story there is a backstory. And the question then is, how do we measure racism? Is it something that can be measured, or is it more of an experience? I guess those are the kind of questions that we need to continue breaking down as we continue engaging as a country on race relations, racism, and how it manifests itself in those myriad of ways. But thank you very much for your insight this evening. That is Gabriel Krauser from the Institute of Race Relations, as we continue having conversations that matter.